Welcome back, everyone. So I think something, I'm in a slightly different role right now, so I also want to, first of all, thank Wesley for the invitation and for Shreya and the Paul Mellon Centre for facilitating this and bringing me all the way from Berlin to be here and to engage with everything that has been said in the past few days. It's been really enriching and enlightening in many ways, and a breath of fresh air also coming from Germany and the political situation there, which is, in many ways, I'm not going to say much about it. But it is my absolute pleasure to be a respondent to Wesley Goatley's talk today and to ask you probably some hopefully interesting questions. But I'm going to let you introduce yourself and get to your business. So, yeah.
Thank you so much, Pedro, for being here. Pedro's not got a proper introduction yet, I feel like. Pedro's a great sound artist, researcher, critical thinker in design spaces, art spaces and beyond. I've been a big fan of his work for a very long time, so I was really delighted that he wanted to come and hang out and talk about the work. It's been a real treat, so thank you. Thank you to Shreya and Ella and Femi and Kathleen and everybody else within this, Greta for her near invisible labor, always being behind the camera. And it's really, really nice to have worked with such a lovely team, and the program has been fantastic. If this is your first time at the PMC, it was my first time the last time this event was running 2 months ago. It's sort of like this all the time. It's really good. So you should come along to whatever the next thing is. And yeah, thanks for being so generous as hosts as well. It's been really lovely. And thank you to the other speakers today, and it's been great. And I hope to be able to, me and Pedro were looking at each other a couple of times being like, we're going to talk about that a little bit later as well. So that's good. Okay, so to start off with, the title of this work, of this small intro presentation, which is going to be like a short run through some ideas and some practice so that we can get to the point where I can just have a conversation with Pedro and that I feel like we're all in the same place in terms of where the ideas are coming from, because we've been talking about it for a while. So I just want to whiz through some practice and whiz through some ideas, and then we want to get into the weeds a bit. So I like putting towards at the start of a slide deck like this, because this is like work in progress. It's thinking in progress. It's a practice of everyday life of just trying to struggle and find your way through in the dark by your hands, as it often is with these sorts of practices and engaging with these sorts of ideas. So thanks for sharing in the space with me as we talk about these things. This is not fixed, and this is not a kind of a roadmap for how anybody else is doing things. It's just, I just wanted to share the struggles that I'm having in this space right now, and hopefully they will be relevant to other people in the room. So to kick off, my name's Wesley Goatley. I'm a critical artist and researcher based here in London. I've been working in and around the kind of politics of technology and what art practice can do in and around those subjects for some time now. Specifically, my work critiquing AI systems and related things to AI systems began with a project called The Dark Age of Connectionism in 2017, and I've kind of stayed with that particular trouble since then. And to kind of kick off, I'm going to introduce that first part about anti-capitalist AI, and to really talk about resistance a bit, because obviously I don't really see that there can be a kind of a necessary, by definition, an anti-capitalist AI per se, because much like anything produced under capitalism, it's inherently produced under conditions of exploitation and extraction. As Adorno sort of said, there's no right living in the wrong life, and as Silverman Zion said, when the world is sick, can't no one be well. And I feel that tension in talking about this subject, and so I'm not claiming that anything that I'm showing here gets itself out of capitalism to look at it differently, but it's more about how do we create forms of resistance within the structure that we find ourselves and using the tools that we have around us. So specifically, just a primer for anybody who is perhaps new to these sorts of conversations, the forms of extraction and exploitation take the role of things like well-observed inherent theft of data that went into training many different types of very popular large language models and other sort of image generation systems and things like that. There's also the disregard, contempt that people within power in a lot of these organizations, including OpenAI, who have a contempt for the impact on labor that these systems that they've created have. This is the CTO of OpenAI at the time, and that's her quote. And then, as well as that, there's the extractive nature of it. Under capital resource extraction happens on a lot of vectors. Climatic being a major one for this technology. This is from actually the data it's referencing is 2023's increase. So 49% increase in 48% increase in Google's emissions and 29% increase in Microsoft's emissions, based mostly around data center expansion due to the rollout of AI. Both companies have kind of pinned AI as the reason for that. And the data center operation and the training of those systems are incredibly consumptive systems. We've sort of invented them, or rather they've become popular at the possibly worst time in history that we could have done. I like to think of this as a real Nero fiddled while Rome burned. I know it's not, he didn't really, but classicists leave me alone. But, I think the point stands. There's an exploitation of bodies at many layers of these systems. Samasource, quite famously in Kenya, is a company that pays workers, which actually in Kenyan translation, sort of $2 an hour isn't a bad wage, but it's extremely psychically harmful work of cleaning data sets, removing all the most toxic, horrific things from them so that the sanitized outputs make it into OpenAI's tools. People are basically being paid $2 an hour to look at the worst things on the internet. So try not to imagine the worst thing you've ever looked at on the internet, but then imagine doing that all day, every day for your job. These companies have huge psychiatric help departments, and PTSD is a very common outcome of doing this work. And it often happens in areas where labor laws are different and less stringent sometimes, or at least they are out of the view of countries where these systems are deployed, largely the global minority, otherwise called the global north. And then there's the relationship to existing forms of power that the AI industry has always been very close to. It's always been very close to the military-industrial complex, like a lot of research is, frankly, across a number of fields. But very close with companies like OpenAI, with people like Paul Mellon, who was both the head of the NSA and also the head of US Cyber Command, now sits on the board of OpenAI. It's not a big board. So these are many different systems that we should be wary of and recognize these tools are kind of inherent to. And so at the same time, I've been a teacher for a long time, and I consider my practice to be multi-document. The piece, the works themselves are one part of it, and then talking about the work is another, because the ideas get reframed in different ways. Teaching is another. I teach these sorts of ideas in a lot of different contexts, and public talks and writing, both in and outside of academia. These are all parts of like a multi-document practice. And so I've been trying to grapple for a long time with what we as practitioners do in this space. I feel responsible to other practitioners because I work with so many of them all the time, all day. I'm very lucky to get to do that, especially earlier career and younger practitioners. And so I've always been talking about the politics of technology for so long. I've repeated ad nauseum the phrase, no technology is inherently good, inherently bad, or inherently neutral. And I said that so many times that one day I just thought, well, then that has to apply to AI. Even given all these contexts, it has to contextually or conceptually apply in some sense to AI tools. So then I was like, okay, well, I guess I'm going to have to try to see what that looks like. So one example of how I've been trying to find out how you could, in some sense, use it for what we may think of as good, if good is towards an anti-capitalist and resistive practice. So I'm going the wrong way in the slides because I forgot that one. Oh, that's a really important one. So obviously, as well as these other forms of exploitation, AI tools are being deployed in active war zones, including the ongoing genocide in Gaza by the IDF through their Lavender target acquisition tool. Okay, so here's how I've been trying, or one example of how I've been trying to respond to this. So this piece is called The Harbinger. It's a part of a new series of works. You're some of the first people to see this. There's only 2 people who've seen this image before, and it's me and the person who did it. Thank you, that person. They're in the room. This piece is an extension of what is currently happening in the NHS with their ongoing data sharing relationship they have with Palantir. So Palantir, the massive US military and kind of international espionage company, manage a lot of patient data for the NHS right now. And this was an attempt to look at a number of different functions of how techno-capitalism works around the world in a lot of different contexts right now, how AI is deployed to undermine labor, to attempt to make more efficient a number of systems, which basically just means try to make them cheaper and kind of worse by the people who run them. So it's taking a bunch of existing logics about how techno-capitalism is working, and then just gathering up those ideas and saying, well, what if that happened with the NHS? So this is a GP's assistant. It's not an assistant. It attempts to replace entirely GP's labor. A GP's assistant that sits on a desk and runs a voice assistant, a smart AI medical assistant that listens to the entire content of patient and GP conversations and then generates powerful, smart AI diagnoses by sending all that content to the Palantir data centers for processing. It comes back with an authoritative diagnosis and a prescription. And this would be lauded under the Starmer government, for example, for making the NHS smart and efficient and innovative and new, and all those logics that we've seen when AI have been bolted into systems that we don't want them to in general. So this again, this isn't a render, it's not a simulation. This is a fully working on-device object. So the point is that it sits in front of people that come into the gallery or the space, or it was shown in a museum. It was shown at the Lowry in Manchester a couple of weeks ago, where people can just sit down and chat with it. And the point of a work like this is to try to give people a real tangible experience of what that engagement would feel like. What it would feel like to share personal medical information, even if you're not doing it for real, because you're like in a gallery. But what would it feel like to be saying that to a device like this that responds in the way it does, that fails in the way these things always do? It will fail to detect your accent if you don't sound like a male-identified person, likely from a country that English has its first language, for example. All these things that fail and again in all of our interactions with AI systems. What it would feel like to have that, but be in a system where we often turn to in crisis points. And I don't want everyone to have to wait till they get to that crisis in order to experience this. And so I made this thing as a way of saying, this is a route to hopefully experiential knowledge for the audience member to get a sense of what this might feel like, so that if they see a proposal of it coming up in the news, they can think, hang on a minute, I've sort of experienced what that might be like and it wasn't good. I try to actually present the work as straight as possible, in a sense that I really think about how a system like this would be designed and how it would interact, and I make a lot of design decisions around that. It's not speculative design. I don't have any sort of relationship with that field. But I think of this more like of just gathering together existing logics and being like, what if this was just put in this one place? The point of making it fully functional and fully on device is also to say that I can make this now. I'm just an artist. I've never been trained in computer science. I'm not an engineer. I'm just an artist and I can make this, which means that Palantir can make it much smaller and cheaper. And so we could easily have this in 6 months' time. That's the kind of time frame I'm interested in thinking about. And so to attempt to kind of give audiences a real, tangible engagement with that potential future was something that I found to be really beneficial, because I don't want people to have to wait until they interact with one of these things at a point of crisis to understand, what that's going to feel like, because I think we've got possibilities for resisting that in the meantime. So as I said, 2 weeks ago, I showed this at the Lowry in Manchester. 2 days ago, the Starmer administration announced that they were going to officially be making recommendations that GPs use AI to record all of their notes, including notes on patient conversations. So it sucks when the thing you're trying to say, like, wouldn't it be really bad if, then happens so quick that the actual exhibition really hasn't happened yet. But like you say, these are existing logics. They're existing practices that are happening in the world. I think that it's good. It's a reasonable form of anti-capitalist practice to try to say that this hasn't happened in this space yet, but these are the logics of techno-capitalism, and if we can train ourselves to understand how those logics can switch between spaces, we can get there before it has, and hopefully, generate forms of opposition to that, demand not to have it. Don't be sold the lie of efficiency and smartness and innovation, et cetera, et cetera. So the second thing I just want to introduce before we move on to the conversation is the notion of post-abundance. A lot of my work has always been really engaged with climate-related issues. I was working in air pollution politics for a long time in the kind of mid-2010s, thinking about it as a space that often has a real, it disproportionately affects people who are already heavily disempowered within whatever cultural setting it is around the world. Normally the people who suffer most from air pollution are people who are already suffering under different forms of power already, be it like ethnic, religious, patriarchal forms of power. But post-abundance is really thinking about the tensions of where we live right now in the kind of context that we're in a place like the UK, for example, and a lot of parts of the global minority / global north, where a lot of the systems that are being built and deployed at scale are massively unsustainable, can't be sustained by the planet. I like to refer to this as the age of computational excess. None of us asked for Google to put shit AI results at the top of the browser. All we can do is hide them. We can't stop them. There is that constant rollout, that churn of data, again, going back to Google and Microsoft's increase in those emissions. Those are already huge companies with massive carbon footprints. Those emissions are, a catastrophe, basically. And so thinking about how do we talk to audiences and other people and publics about this? How do we frame this era as kind of like excess in some sense? And how do we ask for any sort of computational degrowth, or even like frame what that might look and feel like? And kind of through that, how do we think about other futures that aren't the two that we're often offered in countries like we're on now, but all over the world? I see this. I'm very lucky to work with students from all over the world, and I hear this repeated again and again, that we've got two futures that we're offered, right? The shiny silver and glass AI utopia. You know what it looks like. Close your eyes. You've seen that picture. Blue sky, green grass, no humans, towers, glass, robot arms, right? Or the climate collapse, and that's it. That we're often asked if we don't want that one, we've got to go all in on this one. And so thinking about what other futures might be has been a big part of this end of my practice, and it also intersects with the technological and the climatic and the kind of political, as most of my work does. So a piece like Newly Forgotten Technologies, this was shown at a few places, including Science Gallery London a couple of years ago. This was an installation for 200 discarded smart devices, and I reprogrammed the voices of the voice assistant within those devices to do a new job. And that new job was to tell stories that I'd written about different possible futures where we might abandon, give up, ban, forget, ignore the kind of current era of consumption, particularly around new technologies and AI-enabled technologies like smart speakers. So each of these devices were basically telling a story about why they were thrown away in this kind of speculative space. Thinking about the deep time of an object like this, of like how long something like this takes to break down, how long those stories would survive were it to actually do that job. But really it was an extremely laborious way of telling a lot of stories in a gallery, because there's about 10,000 words of fiction that I wrote for this, and obviously no, I didn't use generative AI for any of that. But this is an example of talking about AI without using AI, right? While the last project was me using like an on-device system to do a kind of a voice-to-voice interaction. It involved no cloud data centers in that project, because I won't use cloud data centers in the operation of my works, because I'm a climate-oriented practitioner. But this one was talking about AI, and using the only AI in its operation was the synthesized voices that I generated at the start of the project. So there's no live cloud data access in this piece either. So you can talk about AI and not use AI in your work. It's just worth kind of putting it out there. But also this was talking about what e-waste landscapes, encountering an e-waste landscape in a place that's not Ghana, for example, which is where a lot of the world's e-waste really ends up. Used to be parts of southern China and some parts of Venezuela as well, but less so in either of those countries now. But Ghana has a huge amount of e-waste there. So it was also about trying to in any way gesture towards those landscapes and in any way bring those to presence in a part of the world that doesn't see that. I found that to be really valuable, and to also be thinking about what are the many different futures we could talk about that aren't what we have. You know, what are the futures that are bad ones that we don't want, and what are the futures that we would want? What are the ones where we ban this, where we come together differently? Every single story talked about people, talked about social movements, talked about cultural change. None of the stories talked about sentient machines, because it's not sci-fi. And AI doesn't exist. This work to me was something that was really lovely to watch people walk through and sit in, because all it asked was audiences to come and sit for as long as they were interested in hearing stories. It was totally non-linear. It was generative in the good old-fashioned use of the word generative, in the sense that the stories were always being cycled in and out in different patterns. It was kind of randomly oriented throughout the day. You could come in and out at different times and get these different glimpses in this space. The last work, which I won't explain because it's downstairs and there's a text for it, and some of you have probably already interacted with it, which is the Horizon, which is actually the second part of 3 works. The first one was the Palantir device I showed at the start, and this is the second one. You know, and without going into detail about this particular work, it is also trying to say what might computational post-abundance really look like to us, what would it feel like, but also how does it give us a different way of doing AI today? Because the device downstairs is a fully low-powered, low-carbon AI device that runs off batteries and doesn't use cloud data centers, and has been refined so that it can't replace labor. You know, it's assistive to somebody who's interested in replacing oregano with thyme and other such things that it does, and playing back very sad voice memos from someone they've lost. And so, these sorts of practices, I think, are really nice ways to, again, give audiences a lot of agency to sit with it. It's not something you have to rush through. You can take as little or as long time in this work as you want. And my hope in making these sorts of works is to try to make them as deep as possible, in a sense of someone who wants to really sit with it and stay with it can be rewarded for that. But in doing so, trying to articulate just these other futures that may also present some weird little glimpses of functioning post-capitalism as well. You know, that how do we make something that doesn't explicitly cause or indulge harm at the scale that it currently does. The very last thing I'll say is there is a third work to this series, and all 3 pieces will be shown at the Edinburgh Festival in August this year. And so if you're there, come and see the work at InSpace Gallery. Then the third piece, after the Harbinger, which was the first one, the Horizon, which is this one, the third one's called the Hope. And that is much like I was taking all of the different existing functional parts of techno-capitalism and applying them in the NHS context with the first work. This last one, The Hope, will be a similar kind of form factor, but we'll be taking all of the really good practices we have around computational culture and around community ownership and around collective action and cooperation and open source culture. All those things are laying around us, and bringing them together and say, what if someone tried to then create an AI object out of that? What would that AI look like? Would that be something we would be able to say, I think this is as close as we can get to a good AI? And that will also be a fully functioning device that will do what it says on the tin and won't be a render, and will also be something we can point to and say, we could have this in 6 months' time. Because I don't think that any critique is finished until you've been propositional with it, until you can say there's somewhere else we can go. So with that, I would really like to begin a conversation I've been looking to for ages with Pedro.
Yes, that was a brief yet deep glimpse into your practice, Wesley. And I mean, we have kind of been rehearsing this conversation for the past few days, and my job, I think, is to try to trace some sort of connection, or at least a web of relations to which we can enter different aspects of your work, while also, I think, which is, you know, the question being asked in this event, what is research now? Also to try to kind of mobilize this to, you know, to what's next and to what's to come, right? So I would like to begin this conversation by entering through kind of from the Harbinger towards the Hope, right? because I think there are kind of examples of certain things that you've been talking about, in which your use of technology in itself as a critical practice, and by asking or by making that statement in which like it's not inherently bad, not inherently good, not inherently neutral, already signals a move from morals to ethics, right? Like so it becomes an ethical standpoint. And my question, or kind of what I want to get to in this, by moving into this direction in the use of technology as a critical practice and so on, is to, because in works like The Harbinger and The Horizon, we see a specific form of critique in which technology is mobilized to kind of really stay in this blurry or fuzzy zone of that ethical standpoint that requires from the visitor to take, in a way, right? But I'm wondering, like, especially thinking about The Harbinger and the connection that happened 2 days after you exhibited it, like kind of like the manifestation of that future, right? If we are not in the moment in which we are encountering the limits of critique and what critique can do, right? And I've been thinking a lot by reading people like Denise Ferreira da Silva, for instance, in which she's also articulating this idea that this type of critique cannot, it just doesn't do anymore because it is invested in solving the problems throughout the same, she calls it the ethical pillars that constitute notions of democracy, freedom, justice, and so on. That's a much more complicated question, which I'm not going to get into, but I wanted to ask you, like, with the hope, if there is this move that you are encountering in your practice towards the limits and limitations of critique, and with that, I wanted to ask you as well, like the notion of a future to come, whether we necessarily need to do propositions about future that delineate a future, or the move is not perhaps to care for a space of emergence of futures that we don't know yet what they are, right? And if that's not a more generative in the radical sense of the word, if the hope moves in that direction, or if yes or if not, like how do you see your practice kind of moving towards that direction?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. I mean, yeah, and these are tensions that I think everybody working in critical spaces, if they're in any way reflexive about what they're doing, you do. I think my question to Sam was like, do you stay up at night thinking this is all worth it? Because obviously I do, you know, and like I think most of us probably do to some degree, of being like, well, what? And again, what is an ethical response to it? You know, if your brain works in a certain way, and it's either to give up and do nothing, or attempt to do something that you feel like has social value, or at least that you can point to and say there is potential, like that there's potential that this could spark something in somebody. And I think that's what the real value of what art does. You know, art provokes this form of unfinished thinking, right? That it never fully resolves. The art experience was never it resolves. I didn't go to art school. I just work in one now, but like I didn't go. I like being the person who didn't go to art school and art school, but it wasn't available to people of my background really when I grew up, and so I often think about the fact that I like being in art spaces because I recognise that the gallery is a space where people walk in and they have a totally different view of the world than they do when they're outside. When they're outside, they step over a crisp packet. It's just a crisp packet. They walk in and there's a crisp packet nicely lit on a plinth with like a famous person's name under it. They're like, oh, like what is the crisp packet? Well, it's the beauty and destruction and the disregard of the everyday and things like that. And it's just a very weird way, but it functions all over the world in that way. Like people in many, many different cultural settings have that engagement with art. It's one of it's kind of the really beautiful things about it. And I've found that to be just the most compelling way to then be having conversations that I think are culturally really valuable to have, that I don't feel are massively being had in sort of those spaces, particularly in an era of digital art work right now, that arguably is becoming more like less politicized. You know, it's hard to see that looking at the Paul Mellon Centre, I think, but I think a lot of bigger, more visible digital art practitioners like Refik Anadol are very consumptive and and misleading, misrepresentative with their work, and I think that's a real problem for the field. But to get into the question of, so that's sort of thinking about what can critique do. It's like, well, I hope something. When I find something better, I'll do it. Definitely, because I wasn't doing this before. I was doing different forms of direct action in and out of my life and things like that. And if I find something better, I will, and I hope I do, because it means I've found something better, right? But then prompt me again the second half of the question.
Whether or not the hope moves into that direction.
Oh yeah, and the hope for me is about making myself always responsible to, and this is what I was going to get to with your point about futures, is that it's not about saying this will be the future. It's about just offering any space for thinking about things outside of that binary, outside of that notion of those two things. Because like I say, I speak to people from all over the world, mostly younger people from all over the world, but they all can close their eyes and picture the AI utopia and the climate collapse. But outside of nationalist notions of futures that are generally are basically like this country will become more prosperous, there is also a kind of a push towards a real binary nature, and that they're seeing a lot of cultural pressures in a lot of their countries as well that I feel here, and we have a good kinship because of that, that they are also only offered these two alternatives. So it's really about saying many different futures are possible. I think if I was only ever talking about one future, I'd be sort of a bit stuck. But so many of my works has been like, right, here's 10 more, here's 10 more, here's 10 more. And the point is to be like, these are the last 30 that I've thought of that I think are reasonable and interesting to consider. Like, you can do 30 as well. Like, we can do it. And I just think we're not given a lot of opportunity to do so. A lot of people feel their futures are shut down on a number of levels, whether or not it's because the body they inhabit or the political moment they've been born into, that there is a lot of a shutdown of one's own future and a future for one's community and a one for people like them. And so it's a desperate attempt to try to nudge that in any way. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting because now, I mean, when you were doing the presentation and you're passing through the images and you mentioned this kind of binary between the kind of like sleek AI future glass or the climate collapse, I mean, the first thing that came to mind is Gaza, right? So Gaza right now, the rubble and the AI future that Donald Trump wants for it, that's exactly the encapsulation of this binary futures that are, like not only possible, but they are like presented. They are already like being mobilized in certain ways. So for me, like I come back to the other work of yours, NFT, in which that aesthetics of rubble and that aesthetics of destruction also offers that possibility for other stories to be told, right? And in that, I was also thinking about this post-abundance future that we've been talking about. And I wanted you to talk a little bit about more about that because, and I'm also thinking together with, again, like with philosophers like Denise, but also artists like Jota Mombasa from Brazil, this idea that Jota Mombasa talks about, which is this notion of solvent care. So this notion of caring for things that actually need to be gone and destroyed, right? And I think NFT in its presentation kind of dabs into that idea of a destruction, an aesthetics of destruction that actually is the kind of destruction that we want in certain ways, right? So if you want to talk a little bit more about this post-abundance future, which is something that I think we need to care for, right? Like this, we perhaps need to care for a world that is post-abundance right now. So if you can talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I mean, for me, that work, so every single piece in that work was I bought on eBay or were donated by some people. They were all things that were already broken. They were listed as 4 parts or not working. And that was kind of like a private rule I had for myself in making the work, because I don't want to make works that are really in and of themselves consumptive if I'm talking about consumption. Like I really try to be very rigorous in my own processes. That's just how my brain's wired. It's not in the description, not in the wall text. It's not really in the work. But if I don't do it that way, I feel like I'm letting myself down, basically. So it was occasionally frustrating when I really needed extra of X or Y, and no one was trying to sell a broken one at that point, because I didn't want to buy used. I wanted to buy things that were at the end of their useful life to the person who had it, and to try to find new use for the thing that had been produced under great cost to landscapes and people that were not in the place where those devices were sold, and just the injustice of that even though looking at those objects always depresses me, and my studio has 200 of these, so for me, my studio is quite a depressing place. But I really wanted to give that some sort of life and attempt to use that in a context that challenged those powers that created them in the first place and the logics behind them, and again tell stories from different, with a whole range of abstracted voices within there. I'm not going to be speaking for anybody else's experience, but I can talk about different spaces in the place that I come from, which is here. So thinking about post-abundance in that sense, that doesn't necessarily need to be a negative, right? None of the stories were like, oh no, it's terrible that we've lost AI now. It's like some of them were like bad things that happened in those worlds that were, climate crisis had impacted some of those stories, but some of them were about collective action, and they were in unnamed places necessarily. I wasn't super explicit about where these things were happening because I think there is a lot of parts in the world where these forms of resistance do already happen and can happen at smaller scales and bigger scales, and I wanted to draw attention to some of those, and some of the stories reference the things that had already really happened in real life in various parts of the world, and so thinking about allowing post-abundance to both feel like something that could be aspirational. There's a potential for a post-abundance future to be something we'd want to avoid, but there's a potential for something that it offers something which again feels in any way like a functioning post-capitalism, because obviously we have a real absence within places that are seeped into the bone with capitalism. That capitalism obviously like consumes and commodifies all of its own critiques, as Fisher was so brilliant at articulating for us. But of also thinking about what in talking about post-abundance, can we also talk about post-capitalism in any way? Can we talk about things functioning after we've left these systems behind? I think those are really valuable to talk about. I mean, it's why I still teach, I think, because I know this is going to be contentious for some teachers in the room, but I do regularly think that I'm really, really lucky to be able to teach, and especially the people that I teach, and some of the people who I have taught in the past are here in the room, and it's always so nice to see you all. But I do think of teaching as being quite a wonderful thing at times, because it's one of those things that in a functioning post-capitalism, quite a lot of how teaching works as a job would stay the same. The mechanism of how people get into the room and how the lights stay on would change, but what you did once you were in that space and the things you were talking about, if you're lucky enough to talk about things that are really important to you and you talk about this sort of practice, you might well find yourself having almost exactly the same engagement. And I think that I'm trying to look just in my life, but also through the practice, for different little examples of things that can function well without capitalism, and that we can really easily imagine them functioning well without capitalism. I find that to be like really fruitful at this point in history.
No, that's really nice to mention like the role of pedagogy into this, because I think also like to think with Fred Mote and Stefano Harney, like studies what happens like beyond the classroom, but also I think like as teachers we also have somehow the responsibility to making those spaces still available, right? Without tooting my own horn, I have a paper that I wrote with dear Dana Abdullah, who's here, which you talk about the necessity for minor gestures within pedagogical practice. And I think what you're describing is one such minor gesture as well. But I want to come back. I mean, we are almost like out of our own time, no? Like for, yeah? Because I have two questions, and one of them is going to be a mouthful, but I wanted to kind of like make my way through there instead of making a big jump. And I wanted to come back to the post-capitalist thing that you mentioned, because I've been for a long time kind of almost paralyzed by the idea that to think about a post-capitalist future is to incur sometimes into accelerationist discourse of the only way is through, right? But recently, I mean, I was reading Ailton Krenak, indigenous Brazilian theorist, and he was talking about the necessity of poking holes into the walls of cities so that the forest can come in. And I think this is a beautiful metaphor because it does not put this movement towards getting through, but rather allows something else to come in, right? And I'm thinking of that, and it's kind of a stretch, but I'm going to try to make a point. I'm thinking of that, also thinking about the 200 Amazon echoes that you have in your studio, and thinking about what I have been calling in my own head the Audre Lorde paradigm, in which, every single conversation about technology as a critical practice eventually falls into the master's tools who never dismantled the master's house, right? And I have to say that I have been kind of growing tired of that statement being used as a blanket to prevent this critical examination of the innards of technology and critical practices. So thinking together with Krenak of like poking holes and letting the forest come in, but also thinking about your gargantuous job of accumulating 200 Amazon echoes. If you can talk a little bit, we talked about it, that's why I'm riffing on the Algelor thing, because we talked about it and then Maya mentions like, yes, okay, we're getting there. So, I mean, I think there's something to be said about the role of critically examining the innards of technology as a critical practice that I think allows us a different move other than just, you know, accelerating these devices until they provide the collapse that we need, right? It's not exactly a question. I just want you to talk a little bit more about that, actually.
And I love that. When Maya brought up in her talk, we were like, yes, there's the Audre Lorde paradox we were talking about earlier. And that idea of, you know, I'm going to say it in public on record, there's no king but King Lud. You know, like I am somebody who believes that certain machines should be destroyed for the good of workers and people and communities. But also I'm somebody who, like, you know, has always been interested in technology from a young age. I was a real nerdy kid, as many of us were. You know, I was short and quite overweight, and, you know, didn't socialize very well and didn't enjoy sports. And yeah, exactly. No, we see each other, Pedro. This is why we get on. You know, and so I have a natural proclivity to being interested in these things, and I try to channel that because obviously artwork is exhausting, and if it's like any form of direct action, right? It's like I used to do a lot of fox hunt sabotage, for example, and I was involved in a lot of different animal rights activism in the late 90s and early 2000s. A lot of just like punching cops and running away type stuff, you know, running away really fast. That space we used to talk a lot about, like, well, what spaces do you work in and what don't you work in? You know, because like a lot of people were working animal rights, but we're also working in human-centered, you know, situations, but they also cared about the disempowerment, you know, of animals and the injustice of those things, and just violence in general, and all the systems that were connected to it. And so we used to talk about, like, how do you manage your energy levels, you know, and we would feel guilty that we weren't also doing X or Y practice for X or Y, you know, problem in the world. And it was really like you have to pick your battles, because this stuff takes so much energy to do it properly, because it takes so much time, and you feel stupid for lots of art practice, especially technological art practice. Everybody who works with technology in their practice knows this. You feel dumb for loads of it, and it's long and slow if you didn't have training. And so I think you really have to be like, you have to really want or feel that that's the place that you can make that contribution. And for me, it's like playing around with tools and technologies. And even though, like I presented at the start, I was really explicit about saying that there's no non-capitalist produced AI, you know, like they are all those systems, as is anything. They're not, you know, new for that. As is anything is the product of those systems, and therefore has the legacy of that. But if we let that be the reason why we don't do practice with them, for example, then we would not do practice with anything, because what has been produced. I mean, you know, you could go as far as saying that then, you know, language, which is often which is almost always a product of violence over histories in a country like the UK, it's especially so. You know, like the language is just a history of migration and invasion, basically. You know, that I think that it's even more important under those contexts to remember the point you were going to make when you start talking about language, which was about bugger, it's gone.
I do have another question, but I think I don't want to take more space. I think we can open for the audience. And if there is time, I can ask my mouthful of a question. Otherwise, I can do that over beer. So let's open to the audience. If you have questions, comments to Wes.
So I was not familiar with your work, and I wanted to find out what your definition of post-capitalism is. Is it the lights have gone out and we're back to bartering?
That So those are the forms. I mean, yes, potentially, right? I mean, I think the point is that, and this feels like a much bigger conversation, and that I don't have an ownership over discussing that field. There are people in the room, I'm gonna look at Nick, who probably would feel more comfortable with having that conversation than me. But I am very interested in what comes next, and in articulating what's wrong with this system, and being able to say where violence happens within it and where it doesn't need to or wouldn't have to, or how can we can imagine a system that doesn't involve this sort of these forms of violence against all these different types of bodies, that is inevitably everybody's. But obviously one form of something that comes next could well be barbarism, and people like Kohei Soto talk about that, about these different potential futures, one of them being barbarism up to like degrowth communism and things like that. I think those are really I like his work for that reason, that he articulates these different possible systems that again I think are systems that, while not being the only systems that could be possible next, they do make sense from a way that humans organize themselves and have done for a long time, as to what could come. And I think that, at least in his writing, and I'm not him, and I'm not speaking for him, but if you're interested in these ideas, it's worth having a look at some of his work and going from there maybe. But in his discussions of those things, he does point out that there is a lot of agency for us to be articulating where those things go. And some of that might happen from this point onwards. Some of that might happen where some of these systems, which will inevitably fail, do fail. This piece is about what is partly a story about people living through a failure of some of the infrastructures around them, and the decisions that one makes at that point, and what we might make collectively, communally, what we might come together. The fact that we would need more community action, and it would be somewhat forced upon us.
I was interested because earlier this afternoon we heard about the messy middle, and I was just wondering whether your standpoint was just post-capitalism, or do you envisage the messy middle as well?
Yeah, I think that's, I can't imagine. I'm interested in like the interim points. I don't, I love Star Trek. But
that's full of messy middle.
Oh yeah, well exactly. But also it just sort of leaps. It sort of leaps into life. Everything's fine. We got rid of it all. We're post-capitalism now. But I'm really interested in like the kind of in-between moments, what that might look and feel like, rather than speculating about what comes afterwards. Because I think the in-between moments are way more pressing for us to be concerned with. And so, that's why a lot of my work really talks about very near next steps, things that I'm not generally interested in talking about longer than the 6-month time scale, what I can meaningfully think of could happen in 6 months. And again, it's a research-based practice. I've just been thinking and paying attention to this space for a long time, like many of us have. I'm just particularly trying to articulate those things through practice that largely is about storytelling, through objects and diegesis and things like that. But I think a lot of us are all thinking about these things. Nick's talk yesterday, I think, was touching on a lot of that as well, which is why I really loved that talk. And a lot of the people that I've been in conversation in this room with over the last few days and in my life, we talk about those things quite a lot as well. And I see younger practitioners talking about it all the time, which again, for somebody who's been doing it now for a long time and gets to thankfully go to their shows and talk to them about their work, and also sometimes teach them, I do feel that they're present with that as well, which feels really good to see.
Thanks, Wes. This is fantastic. I was thinking when you were talking about the harbinger and how it gives people the opportunity to think we want to opt out of something like this, right? But the fact that opting out of something like this as an individual very quickly becomes impossible. So you can sort of say opt out, don't accept cookies, all of those things. You can tick the boxes for a while, but very, very soon there's no other choice. If you have to go to a GP, you are part of the system. And so I was curious about how you kind of collective refusal, how can you think about collective refusal, and can some of these practices as artists working with the master's tools and so on, how can we think about collective refusal in productive ways and kind of with a plan,
And I think that, that's a great question. Thank you, Shreya. And I think about this a lot, and I think about what's the value of having this sort of conversation. about, and again, thinking back to your question about like, what's the first step? You know, rather than just skipping to the Star Trek finish, what's the first step? And I think the first step is at least articulating that there can be grounds, that other worlds are possible, that there can be grounds for that we can say, that we can not just accept what will be told to us. That if we don't have any counter example of why we would reject that proposal, because this stuff doesn't happen overnight, right? It goes to your MP, and then it goes, at least in this country, it goes to your MP, and then it comes part of a process of discussion. It gets discussed in the media. People talk about it in the pub. Things are shared. We've seen a lot of forms of collective response and collective action on both sides of the political spectrum that have had impact over the last 20 years. Someone said yesterday about protest being, that lovely phrase, protest being practice for a revolution, and we have seen more protest in a lot of parts of the world that 25 years ago there was less protest in, and those are, I'm like cognizant that that's happening, but also about thinking what's that first step. I think that you don't need to tell people that it's wrong or bad necessarily, because I think people are smart enough that if they get an opportunity to even have space to think about it in a kind of a cultural context that really tries not to give you much space to think about that at all, that then people will do the rest or not. That's up to them. All I can say is that I've at least made it possible that someone could come away from this with a different perspective than what the whole of culture is screaming at them constantly. And I'm really concerned about the volume and intensity and the breadth and the constancy of that screaming, and about thinking of like, what do we do to do anything to chip away at that? And I think it is just a counter narrative, and I think it's a nice start. And I think that then if and exhibiting in very, very public spaces like the Edinburgh Festival, where it's like the most ticketed event in the whole world or something, I think it's like bigger than the Olympics in terms of number of tickets for events, because like every square foot that can be a stage is a stage. Then I like working in a place like that, because like it's a free gallery, and I don't put work in galleries we need to pay to get in, but also loads of people come through, different people, families. The science gallery thing was amazing, because like kids in prams and stuff, and like single parents would be in, or people who were on their own with kids were coming in, and stuff like that, and there was all these different people coming through all the time, and I was like, this is really rewarding, this is why we do it. If it's just for people who already know what I'm talking about, then I can just stay in bed, because this shit is exhausting. I would stay in bed, I would do something else, I'd do anything else, but seeing that is what keeps me doing it, because I do think that those things matter, and speaking to as wider publics about these things matters. And like I say, I think art is a really interesting vector for it, and gets into people's brains in really interesting ways that I just don't know anything else that does. But when I find it, I'll be doing it. Yeah.
Hi, thanks both for the talk. Question is kind of like in the middle of things both of you said. It's about language and the Lord paradox. That application of Audre Lorde I've seen over and over again, and it is used as this cut-off point around technology. But is that largely because people apply it to production and materiality as opposed to ideology and philosophy? Because essentially what Lorde is talking about, the tools are the ideological tools of capitalism and colonialism, etc., not physical tools. And so I was wondering if that could be addressed in some way, and particularly in terms of the way then that language is appropriated, reappropriated by the mainstream, take a word like woke, etc., to come back at us in those ways, and the battlegrounds that are maybe, even when talking about production and materiality, are really ideological.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for saying that, because it kind of circles back to my first question to Wes, which was like the limits of critique, right? And that's why for me the thinking of Denise Ferreira da Silva has been so important, because she's approaching exactly that, right? Like she's saying how critique, because it is invested and it is kind of formed within the ethical and ontological pillars of Kantian philosophy and so on, concepts such as justice, democracy, and critique itself are trapped by those. So that will be a good application of Audre Lorde's statement, right? So with my question to Wes, I was thinking like, okay, how do we move towards not a critique, but actually a systematic analysis of those pillars, or of the role that technology can play. So instead of being like just invested in critique, so it becomes a systematic analysis of the tools and, the systems of knowledge and so on and so forth. So yes, absolutely. I think that's kind of the trap of the Audre Lorde paradigm, because for me, what happens is that it's put usually as a blanket statement to prevent certain forms of doing that are invested in that kind of systematic analysis, right? But you're absolutely right. I think, like, from my side, that was kind of where I was aiming at with the limits of critique question, because I do think that we are reaching like the end point of that possibility, right? Yeah. I don't know if you want to complement that. Yeah. You brought it as well. Yeah.
I think with the technologies we're talking about, many of them are vehicles for particular ideologies, whether it's efficiency, scale, better futures. So I think there's two things in it, in the way that I understand Wes and Pedro talking about it, but in the way that I'm also talking about it, there's the literal level of you can't achieve something through working with the tool itself. Everything is happening outside it. So don't engage with the technology, because to touch the technology means either engagement with the financial systems or the corporate systems that it comes from, that these tools, what they represent. But then there's also this other level of the fact that they are ideological vehicles. And so you need to kind of grapple with both, or have a practice that deals with, like, I don't think it's possible to engage with some of these technologies from the outside without touching them and without understanding how they work. I mean, I personally think it is very lazy when you don't actually understand how they work and what their logics are, because I think really incisive work gets to what are they actually doing with language, or with the automation of particular kinds of social relations, or the disruption of social relations. Does that make sense?
But that's not what Lord's talking about, because Lord's talking holistically about stuff. That's the way Lord is applied. Sorry. That's not the way Lord talks about it, because she's much more layered. She talks about when she gets up and even says I'm a warrior mother, blah, blah. Literally, the list of things she talks about is very, very holistic and layered. And I think what I'm critical of is the application of Lord's philosophy as opposed to Lord's actual philosophy. I'm a real champion of her, and I think it's a misunderstanding and a misappropriation of the term that I'm more critical of.
But isn't it possible to also kind of apply or extend those ideas? I mean, those ideas have a lot of purchase. I mean,
I think she's doing that. Yes, I agree totally.
Particularity that you're talking about, which
I
think
it's the
when
application as opposed to. I think Lord's exactly doing that, and I don't think enough people talk about that with her, because she does. When she delivered that speech, she said I have to leave 50% of myself outside when I go in, because I'm a black, lesbian, nationalist, single mother, blah, blah, blah. And I was the only black person in there. So she says I have to leave all that. And she's very aware of that. And I think it's exactly, maybe that's what's missing from contemporary interpretations or application of Lord, is that it has been sort of snapped up as, it's a meme now. And that's the problem.
Also,
I was about to say, it's almost like a recursive kind of move in criticality itself, right? Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much. Really appreciate your piece and the critique behind it as well. And I really appreciate Pedro's contribution as well with Brazilian philosophers and the way they integrate nature onto the capitalist ideology and how we can balance it. And it's pretty interesting the way that language was built in the first place, not as a neutral tool, but as a need for markets and for societies to be able to communicate and exchange value. And I've been thinking about this possibility of taking those tools and these technologies, as language is, and bringing out of that sense of marketing and profit and usability that serves the system, and bring it back into the creative, humanistic, and integrated way of using it, not as taking the literal tools, but to reimagine, to code it again from scratch. For example, we can think of artists being coders now and getting into technology to really get deep into the roots of it and rethinking it. Just like, for example, in the beginning, the speech and the written word was made to keep profits and markets, and can be also used to poetry later in history. And I'm curious to see what both of you think of it and at which extent it's really possible.
Great question. Two quick points, because I'd really like to hear what Pedro has about this one as well. But the one is to return to something that Maya was just talking about in terms of socio-technical practice, right? Of like artists being coders. That there is an advantage to that when you're working with these tools, because you don't need to be an engineer to be able to kind of open it up and start poking at how it works, and to be able to see some of the judgments that are made, particularly around like black box technologies. You know, it's really, you can literally open them up and look inside and see design decisions that have been made in there, and start critiquing those design decisions and think about the bodies that made those decisions and the bodies those decisions impact. So I'm a big a proponent of socio-technical knowledges, not being an expert, but being somebody who is who wants to kind of like break things down and see how they work, not necessarily to be able to make it from scratch again, but at least to be able to then inform yourself of where the breakages are, where the failures are, where the things are you're not meant to see within certain technologies. And I've always found that to be really useful. The second quick point that is, I just realized, a lovely excuse to talk about something Pedro and I were talking about, which is the AI discourse has kind of co-opted the post-human / more than human discourse. I feel like there are research bodies in the world who I think are quite well-meaning, I suppose, but they author books that list ChatGPT as an author next to a number of other authors who are in various forms of at-risk bodies, flattening the experience of all of that together as a way of saying, oh, but like, isn't ChatGPT also a sort of an intelligence? Question mark, you know, and the kind of more than human like discussion around those things I find to be like really distasteful. As somebody who I was at school in the mid-2000s. I got mid-2010s. I got taught posthumanism like the rest of us, you know. And I really saw the value in a lot of those logics. I was a real head for that stuff for a while. But I do really feel like it's become poisoned. And we were talking recently that like I want to kind of reclaim the notion of like human-centered. You know, human-centered in that like I'm really concerned with people, with lots of people, you know, with disempowerment, how it's functioning in loads of different scales, because it's so easy to see that happening around, and there's lots that you don't see, and there's lots that's kept away from you, you know, and I really want the work to be really oriented towards those things always, which is why there's always stories at it, and all those stories always concern people and their experiences, and I think that like actually reclaiming within the practice of critical digital art that this work is human-centered. I don't believe these things are intelligences. I don't really care massively about mycelial networks. I'm sorry, everybody. Like, it's, you know, I care about lots of other stuff about as equally as I do mycelial networks, but I also care about people largely a bit more than I do mycelial networks, frankly. I see the value in those discussions, but I think that, yeah, the AI, like, is it alive? Does it think? Does AI piss? All those things, you know, that's a constant form of actually what a lot of AI companies really want to encourage a discussion around, that yes, or is it alive? Is it really all powerful? Is it beyond human? Those are logics we really need to be rejecting, and I think that actually like centering ourselves back to humans and bodies, I think is really valuable in that.
Okay, we are a little bit past the time. Thank you very much for your questions. Thanks, Wes, for the presentation.
Thank you, Pedro.
Thanks, Shreya, Ella, everyone.
Thanks, Femi.
Femi.